The winding road, once a ribbon of familiar asphalt unfurling beneath my childhood tires, now felt like a frayed cord, pulling me unwillingly back into the heart of Oakhaven. Overgrown maples, their branches thick with years of unchecked growth, formed a shadowy canopy, their leaves rustling with a dry, papery whisper that sounded less like a greeting and more like a sigh of resignation. The air, even with the windows up, carried the faint, damp scent of decaying leaves and something else, a subtle, mineral tang like old earth disturbed. My grandmother's cryptic death, a brief telegram detailing only natural causes and a hastily arranged funeral, had been the catalyst. But it wasn't grief alone that drew me back. It was a prickling sense of duty, a whisper of a forgotten promise, and a cold, insistent curiosity about the woman I barely knew in the town I had fled. Oakhaven itself seemed to hold its breath as my old sedan finally cleared the tree line and entered what passed for the town square. An unnatural stillness descended. The usual afternoon murmur of distant lawnmowers, the faint cries of children at play, the clatter from the small diner, all were absent. Not a single car moved on the narrow streets. No pedestrian ambled along the cracked sidewalks. It was as if the town had paused, waiting for some unseen cue. I parked outside the old stone church, its steeple a skeletal finger against the muted sky. My own footsteps crunched loudly on the gravel path, each sound amplified, swallowed by the profound quiet that enveloped the town. Inside, the church was sparsely populated. No hushed conversations, no rustling of programs. The air was cool, carrying the scent of old wood, dust, and lilies. The undertaker, a man whose face I vaguely recognized from childhood, greeted me at the entrance. His handshake was limp, his eyes, pale, unblinking, met mine for only a fleeting moment before shifting to a point just past my shoulder. "Cole," he murmured, his voice flat, devoid of the practiced sympathy I remembered. "Glad you could make it." His gaze lingered on the empty space beside me. There was no warmth in his words, no genuine welcome. It was a mere recitation. I nodded, mumbled a thank you, and slipped into an empty pew near the back. From there, I observed the small congregation. Their faces, when they occasionally lifted, were curiously blank. A few familiar faces, the shopkeeper, the postmistress, the librarian, but their expressions were uniformly vacant, their eyes holding a distant, unfocused quality. They sat motionless, almost perfectly still, like figures carved from wood. No fidgeting, no shifting of weight, no surreptitious glances at watches. Their stillness was unnerving, an almost perfect mimicry of repose. The service itself was brief, a monotone eulogy delivered by a visiting minister, as Oakhaven's own had apparently retired. There were no tears, no sniffles, no shared memories, just a procession of solemn, silent figures moving with an almost choreographed precision. As the casket was lowered, the thud of ropes against wood echoed with an almost deafening clarity in the pervasive quiet. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the distinct sensation of being watched, not by any single person, but by the very fabric of the town itself. Afterward, as the few mourners dispersed with the same quiet efficiency, I decided against lingering. The pull towards my grandmother's house, a small, two-story dwelling on the edge of town, was undeniable. The house stood precisely as I remembered it. Weathered paint, overgrown rose bushes clawing at the porch, a general air of quiet neglect. The key, retrieved from a hidden nook I'd known since boyhood, turned with a rusty sigh. Inside, the air was stale, heady with the scent of dust, mothballs, and something else, something faint and metallic, like old pennies. I walked through the quiet rooms, each step echoing on the bare floorboards. The furniture was draped in white sheets, ghostly sentinels in the dim light filtering through the drawn curtains. In the main hallway, a narrow, enclosed stairwell that loops back to the same landing caught my eye. I remembered it from my brief, infrequent visits as a child, an architectural oddity, a peculiar design flourish my grandmother had always dismissed as just how they built things back then. Now, it seemed less quaint and more unsettling. I ascended the initial flight, my hand brushing against the smooth, cool banister. At the landing, instead of a hallway or another room, the stairs simply turned and began to ascend again, leading back to the very same spot I had just reached. It was a closed loop, an endless ascent to nowhere, defying all logic. I walked it again, slowly, deliberately, confirming what my eyes told me. The top step led to the bottom step, which led back to the top, a Mobius strip of wood and paint. It served no purpose, offered no access to any other part of the house, simply existed as a perpetual, circular climb. It was a small thing, this nonsensical stairwell, but it amplified the growing unease. As I stood on the landing, staring at the looping steps, I felt it again, that pervasive sense of being observed, not by a person, by something vast and ancient, a presence that had perhaps always been here, hidden beneath the quiet facade of Oakhaven, now stirring, awakened by my return. The town was not merely quiet, it was listening. And I, Cole, had just walked back into its muted embrace. Their faces, as I scanned the pews, were a study in placid uniformity. Their eyes, when they met mine, held no spark of recognition, no flicker of shared history, only a muted, almost watery gaze that slid away without lingering. It was as if a fine dust had settled over their expressions, dulling the edges of individuality. After the eulogy, a brief, impersonal recitation delivered by the elder, I moved among them, a ghost-seeking connection. I saw the baker from my childhood, his apron still smelling faintly of yeast and flour, though he wore a suit now. "Mr. Henderson," I began, my voice a hesitant whisper in the hushed air. "It's Cole. I used to come by your shop every Saturday with my grandmother." His head tilted, a slow, deliberate movement. His eyes, rimmed with a network of fine, red veins, found mine, but held no memory. "Cole," he repeated, the name flat on his tongue as if testing a foreign word. "Ness, I recall a Cole. A good boy." He paused, a long, uncomfortable silence stretching between us. "Your grandmother, fine woman, always appreciated a fresh loaf." His words were a series of disconnected facts, devoid of the warmth I remembered, the easy banter he'd once shared with her. There was no personal anecdote, no shared moment, just a skeletal outline of a relationship. I pressed him. "Do you remember when she used to tell you about her rose garden, the one he was so proud of?" He frowned, a slight creasing of his brow. "Roses, you say?" "Ah, yes. Many people have gardens. She liked things to be neat." He trailed off, his gaze drifting to a stained glass window depicting a shepherd. It was a practiced dismissal, a gentle deflection that left me feeling hollow. I spotted the postmaster, a man who had known my grandmother for decades, who had even delivered her mail personally on occasion. His handshake was limp, his fingers cool and dry against my own. "Cole," he offered, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good to see you back in Oakhaven." "It's good to be back," I lied, the words tasting like ash. "I wanted to ask you about my grandmother. He was quite close with you, wasn't she?" "Oakhaven has many stories. Old town. Many years." He seemed to search for a thought, his eyes unfocused, then landed back on me with an almost childlike blankness. "Your grandmother, he was a quiet woman, mostly. Kept to herself, but very polite." Again, the same detached observations, the same absence of genuine recall. It was as if they had all been handed a script, a generalized description of a person, and were reciting it by rote. A gnawing unease began to curdle in my gut. This wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a deliberate, almost defensive lack of detail. The funeral concluded, a merciful release from the suffocating politeness. As I sought a moment of solitude, perhaps a hidden alcove or a quiet corner where I could gather my afraid thoughts, I found myself in a part of the church I didn't recognize. The stone steps, worn smooth by countless footsteps, descended into a gloom that swallowed the meager light filtering from above. I took a tentative step down, the sound of my shoe echoing unnaturally. One flight, then another. A shiver traced its way down my spine. I tried again, descending with more determination, counting the steps, noting the unique crack in the third step from the top. Yet, after what felt like 2 full rotations, I stood once more before the same door, the same crack on the third step. It was a cruel, disorienting trick, a physical manifestation of the mental labyrinth I was now trapped within. My heart began to drum a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I stumbled out of the church, the bright afternoon sun a sudden assault on my senses. The reception was held at the old community hall, a place that had once hummed with laughter and gossip. I approached the librarian, a woman with spectacles perched on her nose, who had always seemed to know every book and every secret in Oakhaven. "Mrs. Albright," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you remember my grandmother's collection of local history books? She often borrowed them from you, and sometimes she'd leave notes in the margins about the old families." She adjusted her glasses, her eyes magnified behind the lenses. "Your grandmother, yes. A quiet reader, very respectful of the books." His voice was soft, almost a drone. "I don't recall any specific collection, Cole. Many people read history. It's a popular subject, but she mentioned a particular one," I pressed, "about the first settlers." "No, I don't believe I've ever heard of such a thing. Oakhaven is built on solid ground, Cole. Always has been." Her gaze, though still mild, held a subtle firmness, a gentle but unyielding resistance to my probing. It wasn't just my grandmother's memories that were fractured. It was the collective memory of the town itself. They didn't just forget details. They seemed to have forgotten how to remember, how to connect, how to weave a coherent narrative of the past. Each conversation was a shallow pool, reflecting only the vaguest, most innocuous facts. It was as if a silent, invisible hand had swept through Oakhaven, erasing the vibrant brushstrokes of shared history, leaving behind only the faintest, most generalized sketches. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the drawn curtains, illuminating the silence that had settled here like a shroud. I moved through the rooms, each one a tableau of a life now ended, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud on the polished floorboards. The librarian's unsettling smile, her insistent dismissal of any hollow beneath Oakhaven, clung to me like a damp chill, sharpening my resolve. There had to be answers here, nestled amongst the relics of my grandmother's eccentric existence. I started in her study, a room overflowing with books that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. My initial task was simple: sort, categorize, discard. Yet, with every forgotten trinket I uncovered, a tarnished silver thimble, a pressed and faded wildflower, a small, smooth river stone, a prickle of unease intensified. Grandmother hadn't merely lived here. He had dwelt here, meticulously, almost obsessively, curating her world. There was a method to her apparent chaos, a hidden order I was only now beginning to perceive. Hours bled into one another. My fingers, gritty with the accumulated dust of decades, traced the spines of countless volumes, most of them on local history, folklore, and strange, arcane subjects I barely recognized. The weight of her final days, the cryptic note she'd left, pressed down on me. I felt her presence, a faint whisper in the corners of my hearing, a shadow in my peripheral vision. It was behind a heavy, oak-paneled wall, disguised as part of an elaborate built-in bookshelf, that I found it. My hand, reaching for a particularly thick tome on Oakhaven's early settlers, brushed against a slight give in the wood. A barely visible seam, barely a hair's breadth wide, ran vertically along the panel. I pressed, I prodded, and with a soft click, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a shallow, narrow cavity. Inside lay a single object, wrapped in a piece of oilskin that had long since dried and stiffened. I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat. No title graced its spine, no name on its cover, only a strange, almost organic symbol embossed deeply into the leather, a knot of intertwined lines that seemed to writhe and flow, vaguely familiar yet utterly alien. My fingers trembled as I unwrapped the oilskin. The clasp, a simple brass hook, gave way with a faint groan of aged metal. The first few pages were neat, elegant script, detailing mundane observations of Oakhaven life, dated years ago. But quickly, the script began to change. It grew hurried, then frantic, scrawled across the parchment in a hand that seemed to grip the pen with increasing desperation. A song without sound, a presence without form. The words blurred, then sharpened as my eyes darted across the frantic entries. They don't remember the old ways. They don't remember why we are here. The stone heart beneath us stirs. The journal wasn't just a record. It was a desperate plea, a warning etched in ink. Grandmother had not simply been eccentric. He had been fighting something. I needed to understand. I carried the journal, a heavy anchor in my hand, out of the study. It was a minor disorienting trick of the eye, a spiral that always returned you to where you began, and I'd always found it unsettling. I sat on the worn wooden steps, the journal open on my lap, its pages rustling softly in an imperceptible draft. The symbols now seemed to pulse, to shift, as if imbued with a life of their own. The founding families, they knew. Another entry read, the words almost clawed into the paper. They offered it, a sacrifice of remembrance to keep the balance. But the generations forget. The pact weakens. The forgetting is a hunger, and it grows. My own family, my ancestors tied to Oakhaven's founding. What horrors had they known? What had they done? The implications coiled around me, tightening like invisible tendrils. The journal spoke of a deep, ancient secret, one rooted beneath Oakhaven, a secret that my grandmother, and perhaps my own lineage, had been tasked with guarding. And now, it was failing. The town, its people, their fractured memories, it all began to coalesce into a terrifying, coherent pattern. It wasn't just stealing memories, it was erasing existence. And Oakhaven, my ancestral home, was slowly being consumed. The journal, clutched in my trembling hands, felt suddenly heavier, imbued with the weight of generations. My ancestors, a sacrifice of remembrance. The words echoed in the hollow space of the old house, each syllable a claw scraping against the fragile veneer of my composure. What horrors had they known? What had they done to birth this creeping dread, this silence that tasted of ancient dust and forgotten names? The implications coiled around me, tightening like invisible tendrils, each twist squeezing the air from my lungs. The journal spoke of a deep, ancient secret, one rooted beneath Oakhaven, a secret that my grandmother had tried, in her own fractured way, to warn me about. I stood, the floorboards groaning a protest beneath my weight, and moved toward the window. Outside, the twilight deepened, painting the skeletal branches of the oaks in shades of bruised violet and charcoal. Fewer windows glowed than I remembered, a flicker at the very edge of my vision. A deepening of the shadow cast by the ancient elm across the street pulled my gaze. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the familiar, static silhouette of the tree. My breath hitched. I dismissed it as fatigue, a trick of the fading light. But then, a sound, faint like dry leaves skittering across cobblestones, yet imbued with a strange, sibilant quality. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a low, indistinct murmur. I strained my ears, tilting my head. Hey, was it the wind? My skin prickled. It wasn't the natural anxiety of an unsettling discovery. This was an external weight, an invasive presence pressing down, trying to stifle thought, to smother memory. I felt an inexplicable urge to forget what I had just read, to simply put the journal away and pretend its cryptic warnings were merely the ramblings of a troubled mind. The thought was alien, unwelcome, and yet it bloomed in my mind with a peculiar, seductive ease. I gripped the journal tighter, as if physically resisting the insidious suggestion. The next morning, the unease had not dissipated. It clung to me like a shroud, determined to shake it off, to find some grounding in the tangible world. I ventured into town. The air was still and heavy, the sky a muted gray. The few townsfolk I encountered moved with an unhurried, almost somnambulistic grace. Their eyes, when they met mine, were oddly placid, devoid of the usual Oakhaven curiosity or suspicion. I walked past the baker's shop, a place I remembered bustling even on a Tuesday morning. A closed sign hung crookedly, but it looked old, weathered, as if it had been there for months. Not just since yesterday when I swore I'd seen the baker's wife arranging pastries. I peered inside. The display shelves were empty, the counter bare. A small tremor ran through me. Had I been mistaken? My memory felt suddenly unreliable, like a film reel skipping frames. I tried to recall the baker's wife's face, her name. A blankness. A flicker, then a different image. A tall, stoic man I didn't recognize, standing behind the counter, not baking, but simply staring out at the street. The memory felt implanted, jarringly wrong. Further down the main street, I stopped short. The old clockmaker's shop, a fixture for as long as I could remember, was gone. Not merely closed, but gone. In its place stood a small, freshly painted storefront, advertising Oakhaven provisions. The sign was new, the paint still vibrant, and a young woman I'd never seen before was sweeping the steps, humming a tuneless, repetitive melody. Excuse me, I began, my voice sounding strained even to my own ears. The clockmaker, what happened to his shop? The young woman paused, her broom resting against her hip. Her eyes, a startlingly clear blue, met mine. There was no flicker of recognition, no confusion, only a serene, almost vacant politeness. Clockmaker? She asked, her voice soft, smooth as river stones. There's never been a clockmaker's shop here, sir. Not in my time. Never been a clockmaker's shop. Yet I could vividly recall the intricate gears in the window, the chime of 100 different timepieces. My memory was not wrong. It couldn't be. I tried to push past the sudden, suffocating panic. Perhaps the shop had moved, or I was misremembering the exact location. But the conviction in her placid gaze, the absolute certainty of her words, burrowed deep. That night, back in the ancestral house, the phenomena intensified. They were not words I could decipher, but a continuous, low thrum, like 1,000 insect wings beating in unison, just beyond the threshold of understanding. I paced the floor, my nerves stretched taut. It was an architectural oddity I'd never known existed, a spiral of rough-hewn stone steps descending into impenetrable gloom, then rising again, inexplicably, to meet the very landing I stood upon. It was a loop, a trap, a dead end that led back to its beginning. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This was the house's secret heart, its forgotten artery. A gust of wind, or something that felt like it, blew up from the depths, extinguishing the flickering lamp I held. Not the rustling chorus, but a single resonant voice, ancient and vast, speaking a single, guttural word I couldn't comprehend, yet felt deep within my bones. And it was followed by a sound I recognized with a sickening lurch, the faint, rhythmic thump-thump of something immense, moving slowly, deliberately, somewhere beneath the house. The sound resonated through the stone steps beneath my feet, a primal heartbeat echoing from the earth itself. Whatever fed on Oakhaven's memories was awake, and it was listening. The phantom chime of 100 gears still echoed in my mind, a delicate, insistent symphony that had never truly existed, never been a clockmaker's shop. The shopfront, now a bland, peeling edifice housing nothing, mocked. The vivid image burned into my memory. A cold dread, far more insidious than simple fear, had begun to coil within me. It wasn't the terror of a threat lurking in the shadows, but the chilling realization that the shadows had begun to seep into the very foundations of my mind, blurring the lines of what I knew to be true. I forced myself to breathe, to push back the encroaching fog of uncertainty. There was a purpose to this, a thread my grandmother had painstakingly spun, knowing I would find it. Her journal lay open to a page marked with dried, pressed fern. Beneath the river's slow heart, where the stone weeps, a crudely drawn map, just a few lines and an X, pointed towards the outskirts of Oakhaven, to the abandoned mill that had stood silent for decades. The path to the mill was choked with weeds, the asphalt cracked and yielding to the persistent tendrils of nature. The air grew heavier with each step, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, a melancholy perfume. Their gazes, when they met mine, were vacant, like reflections in dark water. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching, not not with curiosity, but with a deep, unsettling absence. The mill rose from the overgrown landscape like a skeletal beast, its timber frame listing, its windows shattered, eyes gazing blankly at the sky. The air here was thick, heady with the dust of forgotten industry and the faint, sweet, sickly odor of something organic, slowly mummifying. The main entrance, a gaping maw of splintered wood, swallowed me whole. Great, silent machines, their gears locked in eternal slumber, stood like petrified giants. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light piercing the gloom, illuminating spiderwebs draped like shrouds over every surface. My footsteps echoed, each crunch on the gritty floor amplified by the vast, empty space. I felt watched, not by an individual, but by the very stones of the building, by the silent, judging presence of time itself. A perpetual twilight clung to the far corners, where massive millstones, once vibrant with the grind of grain, now lay dormant, covered in a fine, powdery residue that coated my fingers when I brushed against them. Peeling back the heavy fabric, I found them. Not the crude scrawl of a modern vandal, but deep, deliberate carvings etched into the stone. They matched, precisely, the strange glyphs my grandmother had painstakingly copied into her journal pages, symbols I had dismissed as abstract doodles until now. The patterns seemed to writhe beneath my gaze, their ancient purpose hinting at something vast and profoundly alien. The air grew heavy, almost viscous. I touched the cold stone, tracing the raised edges of a particularly complex symbol that resembled a stylized, interlocking spiral. It pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible tremor, a vibration that resonated deep within my bones. My fingers, still on the carving, slid downwards, following a subtle seam in the stone. It wasn't a natural crack, but a cleverly disguised outline. I pressed, instinctively, on the spiral carving. A gaping blackness yawned before me. It was a smell that suggested immense depth of rock and water and buried time. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to retreat, to turn and flee the mill, to forget the journal, the town, everything. But the memory of the clockmaker's shop, the fractured reality, and the vacant eyes of Oakhaven's inhabitants held me fast. This passage, I knew, was the key. It was where the stone wept. It was less a staircase and more a spiraling tunnel, roughly hewn from the earth itself. The passage twisted immediately, forcing me to duck my head. It was an endless, Escher-esque repetition of steps, each return to the landing confirming that I was indeed descending, but disorienting me completely. The sweet sickly smell became more pronounced, a cloying presence in the confined space. I had to know what lay at its end, even if the knowing meant I might never return. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but a deeper, more primal compulsion urged me forward. My grandmother had led me here, to this place beneath the grinding teeth, where memory itself was the currency. The carvings, the hidden passage, the unsettling loop of the stairwell, they were all pieces of a design too vast, too ancient to comprehend fully. Never the word whispered, a chilling echo of the entry that had driven me to this precipice. Never forget, never surrender. The words were a command, a desperate plea from my grandmother, etched into the brittle pages. My breath hitched in the cold air that bled from the passage ahead. It was a maw, a jagged tear in the earth, smelling of damp soil, forgotten stone, and something else, a faint metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat like old blood. I swallowed, the sound loud in the oppressive silence. This was it. This was the heart of Oakhaven's sickness, the root of the fractured memories and the vacant stares. A determined resolve hardened my jaw, eclipsing the tremor in my fingers. I would not turn back. With a final, fortifying grip on the journal, I stepped into the gloom. My boot crunched on loose shale, the sound reverberating, swallowed almost immediately by the dense air. The passage narrowed, its walls rough-hewn, slick with condensation. Then, the first stair. Not a grand, sweeping descent, but a treacherous, irregular cut into the living rock. It spiraled downward, a dizzying helix of rough stone. Each time I thought I'd reached a new level, the familiar curve of a specific moss-covered stone, the same faint tremor in the wall, would confront me, mocking my progress. It felt less like descending and more like being wound tighter into the earth's core, each loop a turn of a key, locking me deeper into its secret mechanisms. The air grew heavier with each revolution, pressing against my eardrums. My own footsteps, once sharp, now sounded muffled, as if the very sound was being absorbed. The walls pressed in, forcing me to duck and twist. It was the sound of immense pressure, of stone groaning under the weight of the world, or perhaps something else entirely. My flashlight beam danced, revealing ancient chisel marks, a testament to hands long gone carving this subterranean labyrinth. The tunnels opened into a cavernous chamber, vast and echoing. My light was swallowed whole, unable to reach the distant ceiling or the unseen edges of the space. Here, the air was still, thick with the scent of minerals and something profoundly old, like dried earth and forgotten dreams. My breath plumed before me, the hum intensified, a low thrum that felt like it resonated from within me. They weren't pictures, not really. They seemed to writhe in the flickering light, symbols that suggested an unraveling, a slow decay of form and meaning. Beneath them, arranged in a deliberate circle, were brittle, chalk-white fragments. Mons, not human, I thought, my stomach churning. These were too large, too thick, some with unnatural curves, like grotesque roots or twisted branches. They looked ancient, scoured clean, utterly devoid of any lingering life, yet their arrangement felt pregnant with purpose, a silent testament to a forgotten rite. The air grew even thicker, cloying, like breathing through a veil of dust and old memory. My flashlight beam wavered, then snagged on something truly alien. Against the far wall, emerging from a fissure in the rock, was a mass of organic growth. It wasn't plant life, not fungal. It was a pulsating, grayish-white blob, roughly the size of a barrel, with a surface that seemed to ripple and contract with an unnerving, internal rhythm. The first direct, physical manifestation, a feeder node. As I stared, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't pain, not exactly, more like a subtle draining, a quiet tug at the edges of my mind. A flash of my grandmother's face, then a blank space where her name should have been, just for a breath. A fragment of a childhood memory. The swing set in the backyard suddenly felt distant, like a story I'd been told rather than something I'd lived. A profound sense of disorientation settled upon me, a quiet hum in my skull that wasn't the chamber's resonance, but something inside me, responding to the thing on the wall. The air around the pulsating mass tasted metallic and sweet, like stale blood and forgotten honey. What? Emptiness? That's the words on the page, never forget, screamed silently in my mind, fighting against the insidious pull. This thing was real. It was here, and it was hungry. This wasn't merely influencing Oakhaven, it was consuming it, memory by memory, thought by thought. And now, it had found me. The rhythmic throb of the feeder node was a heartbeat, slow and deep, echoing the one that hammered against my own ribs. I was trapped in its awareness, a tiny spark in its vast, silent consciousness, and it was reaching for me. The phantom chime, 100 gears turning in a clock that never was, still resonated in the hollow chambers of my skull. It was a delicate, insistent symphony that had never truly existed, yet its echo now felt more real than the stone beneath my boots. Never forget the last, scrawled words from my grandmother's hand, a desperate plea now haunting me in this abyssal dark. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the rock, a low thrumming that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones, a deep, unsettling note that promised something vast and terrible ahead. The journal nearly slipped from my grasp, its weight suddenly immense, a burden of truth I was not sure I wished to carry. It spiraled downwards, a dizzying helix of rough-hewn steps, each turn bringing me back to the exact point I started, yet somehow lower, deeper. It was a trick of perspective, or perhaps a deliberate design, meant to disorient, to make the descent feel endless, inescapable. Finally, the looping stairwell deposited me onto a narrow ledge overlooking a vast subterranean amphitheater. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost to the gloom, but the space below was illuminated by a soft, ethereal luminescence emanating from the very walls, a pale, milky glow that painted the scene in shades of ghostly silver and gray. And then I saw them. They were gathered in concentric circles on the cavern floor, a silent congregation. Dozens of Oakhaven's residents, faces I knew from the general store, the old library, the docks. The elder, whose tales of the town's founding I'd heard as a child, sat cross-legged, his usually keen eyes now wide and vacant, staring at nothing. The stout baker, whose hands kneaded dough each morning, sat perfectly still, his fingers splayed limply on his knees. A colleague, who had once shared boisterous laughter with me over a pint, was there too, his expression utterly blank, devoid of any spark of recognition. They were not moving, not speaking, yet there was a profound, unsettling motion. A subtle tremor rippled through the gathered bodies, not a physical shake, but something deeper, an almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to pass from one to the next. Their eyes, though vacant, held a shimmering quality, like still pools reflecting 1,000 fleeting images, and from them, from the very air around them, emanated a collective murmur, a soft, sighing hum that was not sound, but presence. I watched, paralyzed, as a faint pearlescentness seemed to rise from their forms, drifting upwards to coalesce in the center of the cavern, where it swirled slowly like a nascent nebula. It wasn't just mist, it was the essence of them, their histories, their sorrows, their joys, all being drawn out, refined, and offered. They were not just gathered, they were communing. They were feeding something. The realization struck me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs. This was it. This was the entity. It wasn't just influencing them, it was consuming them, not their bodies, but their very souls, their individual consciousnesses. They were becoming, unknowingly, unwillingly, parts of a vast, silent mind, a collective memory bank for something ancient and hungry. Their fractured recollections, their uniform behavior, it wasn't a symptom, it was the process. They were being assimilated, their identities slowly dissolving into a greater, featureless whole. And then I felt it. A profound, insidious pull. It started as a warmth in my chest, a gentle thrumming that echoed the cavern's slow hum. It was an invitation, soft as a lullaby, promising surcease, an end to the gnawing fear, the loneliness, the burden of my own distinct self. Let your memories flow. Let your worries dissolve into the great river. Be one with us. Be at peace. My own memories flickered before my eyes. My grandmother's knowing smile, the scent of her lavender garden, the sharp tang of the sea air on the docks, the warmth of a shared laugh with a colleague. They felt suddenly heavy, cumbersome, individual burdens I had carried for too long. My legs felt weak, my resolve fraying like old rope. My mind screamed, but no sound escaped my throat. The entity wanted me. It wanted my memories. And for a terrifying, fleeting moment, the thought of letting go, of simply being absorbed, felt like the most tempting thing in the world. The pull intensified, a silent, ravenous maw opening within the landscape of my mind. My memories, once distinct and vibrant, began to fray at the edges, threads loosening from the tapestry of me. My grandmother's knowing smile, the scent of her lavender garden, the sharp tang of the sea air on the docks, the warmth of a shared laugh with a colleague. They no longer felt like mine alone. They bled into a vast, shimmering ocean of other experiences, other lives. I saw flashes of faces I didn't know, felt echoes of joys and sorrows that were not my own, yet resonated with an unnerving familiarity. It was not theft, not erasure as I had feared, but something far more insidious. A dissolution. My identity, my unique constellation of moments and sensations, was dissolving into a collective hum, a vast, undifferentiated consciousness. A chill, deeper than the damp air of the underground network, seized me. It was the chill of oblivion, not of death, but of unbeing. My fingers, still clenched around the worn leather of my grandmother's journal, felt suddenly alien, disconnected. My legs, heavy as lead, rooted me to the spot. A low, resonant thrum vibrated through the very stone beneath my boots, a soundless choir of countless assimilated minds. It was a lullaby of surrender tempting me to let go, to float free in the boundless current of shared experience. It was the memory of my grandmother's fierce independence, her refusal to conform, her cryptic warnings. It was the sharp, individual pain of her loss, a pain that was mine and mine alone. I clung to it, a jagged shard against the smooth, consuming tide. A sudden, visceral revulsion surged through me. The thought of my distinct grief becoming just another ripple in their sea, my love for her becoming merely an echo. My muscles screamed in protest, but I forced my feet to move. I stumbled backward, away from the unseen source of the pull, my back scraping against the rough-hewn rock of the tunnel wall. The air tasted of ancient dust and a metallic tang I couldn't place. Every step was an act of defiance, a tearing away from a powerful, invisible tether. It was a cruel deception, a cyclical trap, but it was also a path, and I needed any path that wasn't deeper into the entity's embrace. I threw myself into it, my breath ragged, my heart hammering a frantic, individual rhythm against my ribs. I could still feel the entity's tendrils probing, testing, seeking to re-establish the connection. I burst through a narrow, almost imperceptible opening, finding myself in the desolate expanse of an abandoned factory, its skeletal remains silhouetted against a sliver of moon. I collapsed against a crumbling concrete wall, gasping, my body trembling uncontrollably. My mind, though still reeling, felt suddenly mine again. The memories, though bruised and shaken, were distinct once more. Individual jewels returned to their settings. This was the true horror, the entity's ultimate weapon, not to kill, but to erase identity, to assimilate every unique spark into its vast, silent consciousness, leaving only an echo of Oakhaven, a town without a soul. The journey felt different now. The familiar streets, the silent houses, the unsettling stillness of the town. They were no longer just eerie. My hands, still shaking, pulled the leather-bound journal closer. This was it. This was all I had. The cryptic notes, the strange diagrams, the fragmented theories, they were not just a record of her obsession, but a blueprint he had understood. He had seen the true nature of the entity, its hunger for collective memory, its insidious method of assimilation. He had written a resonance of frequencies, of a central node that anchored the entity to the town's collective consciousness. Severing that connection, she theorized, might be the only way to disrupt its hold, to break its silent feast. A terrifying, audacious plan. The weight of her legacy, of her unfinished fight, settled upon my shoulders. I was no scholar, no expert in ancient evils, but I was Cole, and my memories, my identity, were still my own, and I would fight for them. I would fight for Oakhaven. The entity sought to erase. I would remind it what it meant to exist. I clung to it, a jagged shard against the insidious tide, the sharp, individual pain of her loss, a pain that was mine and mine alone. This singular ache, a defiant spark in the encroaching stillness, was all I had left to guide me. The town pulsed around me, a low, resonant hum beneath the quiet, and I could feel its subtle pull, a gentle suggestion to release, to forget, to merge. But the memory of her was a barb, catching in the soft flesh of my resolve, refusing to let me drift. The narrow lanes of Oakhaven, once a tapestry of individual lives and distinct echoes, now seemed woven from a single muted thread. The air itself felt thick, not with fog, but with an absence, a void where the clamor of separate thoughts should have been. My first approach was to the greengrocer, a man I remembered for his booming laugh and the way he'd always slip me an extra apple. He stood by his empty stall, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some distant, unseen point. "There's still time," I urged, my voice a raw whisper against the town's pervasive hush. "Remember the harvest festivals? The pies your wife used to make?" A flicker, brief as a firefly's gleam, crossed his face. His lips parted, a soundless breath. For a heartbeat, I saw the ghost of a smile, a spark of recognition. Then, the vast, placid current reclaimed him. His gaze glazed over, the subtle tension in his shoulders relaxed, and he returned to his silent vigil. I tried another, a woman who used to run the small bakery, her hands perpetually dusted with flour. I spoke of her intricate, braided breads, the scent of cinnamon that always clung to her. She turned, her head tilting, and for a terrifying second, her eyes held a depth of sorrow that pierced me. A single, crystalline tear tracked a path down her cheek. A pure, unassailable drop in the ocean of apathy. "The taste," she murmured, her voice thin as spun sugar, "the taste of joy." But the words seemed to pain her, an alien sensation, and the tear dried, leaving no trace as her features smoothed back into the town's uniform calm. This was harder than I'd imagined, like trying to catch mist in a sieve. The glimpses were fleeting, agonizingly so, yet they existed. The entity had not fully consumed them. There were fragments. Retreating to the relative sanctuary of my grandmother's house, I pulled out her worn, leather-bound journal. Its pages, brittle with age, exhaled the scent of dried herbs and forgotten stories. The ink, faded in places, seemed to hold a desperate urgency. I flipped past her daily observations, her complaints about the changing weather, her fierce love for Oakhaven, until I reached the later entries. Here, the script became more erratic, less elegant, punctuated by frantic underlining and marginalia. The hum grows it is not merely forgetting, but unmaking. It feeds on the threads of what we were, dissolving the knots of connection. A memory, truly felt, is a stone in its belly. But how to make them remember? How to make them feel the sting of what's lost? My fingers trembled as I turned the page. My grandmother had intuited the nature of the threat. She understood the weapon. The tapestry must be rewoven, not with new threads, but with the old ones. Vibrant once more, it cannot bear the dissonance of authentic experience. It craves uniformity, the smooth, flat canvas of the erased. There is a song, a rhythm forgotten, a place of confluence. The wellspring of stories, a focal point for the collective consciousness, not to be consumed, but to be expressed. She'd drawn a crude map, a series of looping lines and symbols that made little sense at first glance. A stylized oak tree, a winding path, and then, most strikingly, a peculiar architectural sketch. A structure I didn't recognize, hidden deep beneath the town, perhaps in one of the old, forgotten factory basements or an underground bunker. And next to it, scrawled in a shaky hand, the resonance. Not a sound, but a feeling. A memory given form. A resonance. A memory given form. Was it a physical object? A specific action? A ritual of remembering? The journal didn't provide a clear answer, only tantalizing clues. I needed to find that place, the wellspring of stories. But as I gathered my things, ready to leave the house, a profound disorientation washed over me. I'd walked down the stairs from the second floor just moments ago, but now, the hallway stretched ahead, identical to the one I'd just left. Confused, I turned back to the stairs, descending once more. The steps creaked underfoot. The banister felt familiar beneath my palm. I tried again, slower this time, counting the steps, noting the particular scuff marks on the risers. Down, down, down. Each step a deliberate act against the growing sense of unreality. But no, the landing, the door, the small window looking out onto the identical patch of yard. It was the same. It was trying to break my perception, to make me doubt my own senses, to make me believe that escape was an illusion. This wasn't just a town losing its past. It was a place actively hostile to individuality, actively working to disorient and assimilate. The air grew heavier, passing in, thick with the weight of unseen eyes. I could almost hear the faint, ceaseless hum, louder now, a direct assault on my thoughts. Join us! Be at peace! But the image of my grandmother's scrawled map, the desperate hope in her final entries, burned brighter than the fear. I would not let go. I would find that wellspring, that focal point. I would give memory form, whatever the cost. But my grandmother's map, a desperate, fading whisper of defiance, promised more than this circular despair. My fingers, tracing the brittle paper, felt a faint indentation, a subtle deviation near the spiral's supposed apex. I pressed against the cold, damp wall. The stone, slick with an ancient moisture that smelled of earth and forgotten things, yielded. A draught, heavy and wet, bearing the scent of deep earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood mixed with rain, spilled out. I stepped through, the hidden passage closing silently behind me. My flashlight beam, a fragile spear against the encroaching gloom, cut through air so dense it seemed to absorb light. The passage sloped downwards, the walls no longer carved stone but rough, uneven rock, veined with something that shimmered faintly, like obsidian laced with dull silver. Then a sound. It was the sound of something vast, something alive, breathing. As I descended further, the passage opened into an enormous, cavernous space. My flashlight beam, now utterly inadequate, danced across colossal formations, stalactites and stalagmites that looked less like natural rock and more like petrified organs. And then I saw it. The core! It hummed suspended in the center of the cavern, a colossal, pulsating mass that defied easy description. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a monstrous heart. Within its shifting surface, I saw them, fleeting images, fragments of memory, shimmering into existence and then dissolving. A child's laugh, a woman's weeping face, the stern visage of a long-dead mare, the glint of sunlight on a fishing boat. Generations of Oakhaven, reduced to ephemeral flickers within this terrible, living tapestry. It was organic, yes, but not of flesh and blood. It was woven from the very fabric of existence, a living loom of collective consciousness. A tendril, not of physical matter but of shimmering, intangible energy, reached out towards me. My own memories, my own name, Cole, felt suddenly flimsy, like a whisper in a hurricane. I saw my grandmother's face, not as I remembered her, but twisted, her features dissolving into the mass, her last defiant memories being absorbed. No, I choked out, the word feeling alien in the overwhelming presence. The entity hummed, a deeper, more insistent vibration. It wasn't speaking, but it was communicating, a torrent of sensation and fractured thought pouring into my mind. Join us, be free of the burden of self, become one with the endless peace. The fragments of memory within the mass intensified, swirling around me, trying to draw me in. I saw myself, a younger Cole, laughing with friends, a moment of pure joy. The entity was offering me comfort, offering to relieve the ache of individuality, to dissolve my pain into its vast, tranquil ocean. But I remembered my grandmother's frantic scribbles, her desperate fight to hold on to her truth. I remembered the haunted, vacant eyes of the townsfolk, the silent, uniform movements. This wasn't peace, it was erasure. I fought back, not with my fists, but with my mind. I clamped down on my own memories, pulling them close, refusing to let them be assimilated. I focused on the vibrant, specific details, the scent of my grandmother's lavender sachet, the rough texture of her knitting, the exact shade of blue of the sky the day I left Oakhaven. These were just memories. They were anchors. The entity recoiled slightly, its pulsing slowing for a beat. My defiance was a discordant note in its symphony of conformity. It lashed out again, this time with greater force. A wave of profound loneliness washed over me, the kind that threatened to swallow me whole. It showed me my own fears, my deepest insecurities, amplified 1,000-fold. It tried to break my will by isolating me, by convincing me of my insignificance. My head throbbed, a searing pain behind my eyes. My own thoughts began to fray, to unravel. Was I Cole? Or was I just another echo, another fleeting image in this endless, consuming maw? My resolve wavered, a terrible exhaustion threatening to pull me down into its silent depths. I felt the edges of my identity blurring, my individual consciousness thinning, like smoke dispersing in the wind. But then, a flicker, not from the entity, but from within me, a stubborn, fierce ember of resistance. I closed my eyes, picturing my grandmother's face not as a fading memory, but as a living presence. Her stubbornness, her love, her fierce, unyielding spirit. He had fought this, and so would I. I pushed back with everything I had. I didn't just shield my memories, I projected them. I flooded my mind with the vibrant, noisy, messy truth of Oakhaven. I threw my grandmother's entire, defiant life at it. Her memories of joy, of sorrow, of her tireless fight against its creeping influence. I poured out the raw, untamed chaos of human experience, the very thing it sought to homogenize. The entity shrieked, a silent scream that vibrated through the cavern, rattling my teeth. It was a brutal struggle, not of muscle and bone, but of pure will and the very essence of what it meant to be individual. My mind felt like it was being torn apart, stretched to the breaking point. But I held fast, unleashing every last shard of Oakhaven's true, forgotten history, every personal memory, every defiant thought, a desperate, final volley against the consuming quiet. I would give it back its truth. The fragments of memory within the mass intensified, swirling around me, trying to draw me in. But the joy was hollow, detached, as if it belonged to someone else. The entity was offering me comfort, offering to relieve the aching burden of my own self. It was a siren song, woven from the threads of what I'd lost and what I cherished. But within that vast, seductive current, a single, sharp shard of resistance remained. The echo of my grandmother's fierce, unyielding will, her final, desperate instruction to remember. I pushed back, not with force, but with a sudden, absolute refusal. I clenched my mind, and not against the memories, but against the insidious comfort, the erasure it promised. I focused on the one thing it couldn't fully consume, the raw, painful truth of my grief, the stark reality of Oakhaven's slow decay. It was a jagged stone in the velvet maw of its consciousness, a ripple, then a tremor coursed through the ethereal mass. The pleasant warmth turned frigid, the gentle hum a jarring dissonance. It recoiled, a vast, unseen intelligence withdrawing its tendrils from a sudden burn. A shriek, not of sound but of pure, mental anguish, tore through my skull. It was a scream of a million voices, simultaneously silenced and unleashed, a torrent of forgotten names and faces, all collapsing inward. The pressure in the chamber became unbearable, a physical weight on my chest, threatening to crush the very breath from my lungs. Then, as abruptly as it began, it ceased. A profound, absolute quiet descended, heavier than any noise. I staggered, my legs weak, my head swimming in the aftermath of a psychic concussion. The entity had not been destroyed, I knew, but profoundly disrupted. Wounded, it had retreated, its hunger momentarily sated by its own internal chaos. Each step felt like an immense effort, my body heavy, my mind still ringing with the entity's silent shriek. The air grew marginally cooler, fresher, as I climbed. Then, a peculiar disorientation settled over me. Had I truly escaped, or was I trapped in some residual loop of its broken awareness? When I finally pushed open a heavy, wooden door and emerged into the cool, morning light, the world felt different. The air tasted clean, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth, not the subtle, cloying sweetness I had grown accustomed to. The sky above was a brilliant, cloudless expanse of blue, a color I hadn't truly seen in weeks. My eyes, accustomed to the gloom, squinted against the sudden brightness. Oakhaven was stirring. There was a sound, a low murmur, rising from the town square. Not the uniform hum, but a fractured symphony of confusion and distress. I moved through the narrow streets, my senses overwhelmed. A young woman stood outside the baker's shop, clutching a loaf of bread to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "Why don't I remember your favorite song?" The baker, for his part, was staring at his own hands, a profound bewilderment etched on his face. He seemed to recognize her, a flicker of something in his eyes, but his gaze was clouded, as if peering through thick fog. Further on, an elder sat on a bench, holding a tattered photograph. He wasn't silent, but muttering fragments of names, half-formed memories. Alara, the fishing trip, the old dock. He would trail off, then shake his head, a pain frustration distorting his features. He knew he should asterisk no, but the connections were frayed, the tapestry of his past ripped in places. Some people were crying, some were laughing with a brill, hysterical edge. Others simply stared, their eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying awareness of vast, empty spaces where their lives used to be. The entity had withdrawn, but it had left behind a town of shattered mirrors, each reflection incomplete, distorted. The victory, if it could be called that, tasted like ash in my mouth. Oakhaven was not whole. It was irrevocably scarred, a community of amnesiacs trying to piece together a life from broken shards. The collective silence was gone, replaced by a collective ache. I walked to the edge of town, to the winding road that led away from the valley. I looked back at Oakhaven, the quaint houses, the church spire, the ancient oaks that gave the town its name. They all stood, physically unchanged. But the heart of it, the shared memory, the unspoken history that bound its people, was irrevocably fractured. The entity was dormant, wounded, but I felt its lingering presence, a vast, silent hum beneath the surface of the earth, waiting. My own memories felt sharp, almost painfully clear now, freed from the insidious pressure. I remembered my grandmother, her fierce eyes, her warnings. I remembered the laughter with my friends, the joy that was truly mine, but the clarity brought its own kind of horror. I saw the faces of the townsfolk, their confusion, their grief for what was lost, and I knew that I was the only one who truly understood the depth of their wound. The choice lay before me, stark and unyielding. Or I could stay. I could try to help them, to guide them through the labyrinth of their partial memories, to bear witness to their pain, to help them weave a new, scarred, but perhaps stronger, tapestry. The road outstretched, an inviting escape. The town, behind me, called with a different kind of pull, a silent plea born of shared suffering. The wind stirred the dust at my feet, and I felt the weight of both paths, each a profound burden.